Well, as people filter in, I always love to encourage people to introduce themselves in the chat just so we can get to know our fellow social workers or Michigan social workers across the state. If you just say who you are, where you're from, that would be awesome, just so we can get to know each other a little bit. And those numbers are still ticking, so let's give it a second. Great. Oh man, I love to see all of these different places across Michigan coming together. That's so cool to see y'all. We really do have a mighty social work community in Michigan, which is awesome. I mean, I think we can go ahead and get into it. Thanks, y'all, for being here for the practice pulse session for February. Also, session 3 of our monthly How to Policy series. And yeah, we're going to talk about the understanding the Michigan legislature, how bills become law, and what to expect in 2026. And I'm joined by Chandra Benfield, who I will let introduce herself in just a second. My name is Jess. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Manager here at NASW Michigan. I started fairly recently, but I've been doing work with NASW for a while. I was in Texas doing community organizing for several years and moved to Michigan after that, and fell in love. So I have I stayed here, and I'm in Lansing now, doing policy work, and I absolutely love it. And yeah, happy to be a part of the NASW Michigan family and doing some great lobbying and political advocacy and education work. Deshaun, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Deshandra Bedingfield. So I am a multi-client lobbyist at Capital Services. My background, I used to work for the Michigan Associated School Board, so K-12 education was primarily my background. Now I represent a variety of different clients, including NASW, the Michigan chapter. Just to give a little bit about what a multi-client lobbyist is, we represent our firm, Capital Services. We represent different organizations including a lot of small nonprofits and associations. So happy to see all of you here today. Thank you.
Great. And Chandra is awesome. I just want to give her an even further shout out. Just an incredible, lobbyist and advocacy partner in a lot of this work, and very supportive and helpful in all things legislature. So happy to be joined by her today. So let's get into it. Before we talk about how a bill becomes a law, I think it's important that we just set the foundation for a lot of what we're going over today. I know the slide, has some small text on it, so I hope that y'all can zoom in or anything you need to be able to read it. But, so I just want to start off. So Michigan's government is structured into 3 branches, each with distinct roles. And understanding these roles is very key to effective advocacy. And so first, the legislative branch. This includes 38 senators and 110 representatives, and their core responsibilities are drafting, debating, and passing state laws, approving the state budget, representing constituents directly. And importantly, they can amend or repeal laws and, with enough votes, override a governor's veto. So those are some of the powers the legislative branch has. Second, we have the executive branch, led by the governor, along with the lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and attorney general. This branch implements and enforces laws, manages state agencies, and oversees public programs like health, education, transportation. The governor has the power to sign or veto legislation passed by the legislature. So, there's different powers that each branch has in terms of being able to support or block legislation. And then third and finally, the judicial branch. So this includes the Michigan Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and our trial courts. And their role is to interpret and apply laws, in addition to reviewing constitutionality and, of course, resolving legal disputes. And I just want to have kind of one key takeaway from this whole kind of network of how the government works. Passing a bill is only one step. And so a lot of the policy impact of legislation depends on how those laws are implemented, enforced, and interpreted across all 3 branches. And they kind of work together to essentially, pass and then implement those laws.
Thanks, Jess. So essentially where we are in the 103rd legislative session. So in Michigan, we have 2-year legislative sessions. So we are now in 2025, 2026 legislative session. And so currently the makeup of the Michigan legislature is 58 Republicans and 52 Democrats in the House. Um, so under the Dem trifecta, you had a 56-54. We were always talking about the two-seat majority. Now it's a little bit different makeup in the last 2 years. In the Senate, we have currently 19 Democrats, 18 Republicans. There's one vacant seat because Kristen McDonald-Rivet, former senator, is now in Congress. So if you look down where we say plus one lieutenant governor, just like in Congress, the lieutenant governor gets a vote in the Senate, which is evening out the vote essentially. So basically, currently the Senate is still Democratic led because they have that one vote from Garland Gilchrist. And then the House is Republican led. And this is very important when we talk a little bit more about the environment that we have right now politically. I know that a lot of you might have been really engaged in a Dem trifecta and still engaged, obviously, now that we have a lot of split government and that changes a lot of dynamics as far as policy, influence, and even also thinking about the administration is still Democratic led by Gretchen Whitmer, of course, but we are in an election year. So going into 2027, this will change. So just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as one more comment, about the kind of divided control and why this might matter to advocates, you all as constituents, just to be aware, oftentimes divided control can mean slower movement on bills. It can mean more negotiation and compromise having to happen. And it also means that, for advocates, bills often need to be framed in a way that can appeal across the chambers, and across party lines. So those are just some things that we always keep in mind whenever we're trying to work is that, the divided control or the split legislature does have impact on how we do things.
So we'll talk here about a little bit about legislative leadership. So when we are talking about split government and how advocates and even as lobbyists navigate split government, a lot of the things that we talk about now is having bipartisan bill packages, right? We want one Democrat or two Democrats and one Republican, two Republicans, because we basically want to have buy-in in the House that's Republican led and buy-in in the Senate that's Democratic led. And also, we want the administration, the executive, to also feel as if we're, doing our due diligence to making a bipartisan effort. So that plays into how you all engage as advocates and also how NASW navigates the policy realm as well. So a big part of advocacy is knowing who the stakeholders are and knowing who the, power players are. So when we talk about legislative leadership, right now, this is the current legislative leadership in the House and the Senate. So we have, of course, Speaker Matt Hall, we have Speaker Pro Tem, the majority floor leader. So when we have legislative session days, which is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, downtown Lansing, um, Brian Posthumus runs the floor of session, and we could talk a little bit later about what session is. So the minority leader, because the Democrats are in the minority in the House, is Ranjiv Puri, and the minority floor leader is John Fitzgerald. So in the House, the folks who make the decisions are Speaker Matt Hall and the House Republicans, essentially. But they do have to converse and also negotiate with Minority Leader Puri as well. But when we talk about things such as, will a bill be taken up? Well, that's a leadership decision. That means that we're talking to Matt Hall to try to get any, NASW bill passed, whether a committee hearing, and these are a little bit different. These are not committee chairs. These are just kind of more at the top level. So when we're talking about, oh, we really want to get our bill heard on the floor and have a vote on the floor, these are the folks that we're talking to. We're trying to convince Speaker Hall to let us get a bill on our licensure efforts. We're talking to Minority Leader Puri, to also help us talk to Speaker Hall to get our bill heard. So that's kind of how it operates in the House and also how it operates in the Senate as well. The Senate is Democratic led by Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks. And the Senate did not change over. So the fact of under the Dem trifecta, since the Senate didn't change, they kept the same leadership. So you still have Majority Floor Leader Sam Singh, and then you have the minority leaders as well in there. So same thing in the Senate. So say, we get a bill introduced in the Senate. Wonderful. We have to continue to talk to our, committee chairs. And then also we have to talk to leadership because what those committee chairs do. So for example, um, I'll give Senator Hertel, he runs health policy in the Senate. Senator Hertel talks to when he brings about allowing for a hearing on licensure issues. So that's the kind of relationship that we always kind of have to make sure we're talking to leadership because there is a chain of command, I will say, when talking about policy and how bills get implemented in the process. So the Senate makeup is still the same essentially, but we do continuously have to talk to our, leadership teams in both chambers to get bills heard and also to get bills moving and progressing and get a vote on the floor.
Absolutely. And, from an advocacy perspective, you kind of touched on this already, but like, this is why relationship building isn't just about your own legislator, right? I think for most constituents, it's really important to be contacting your own representatives about the issues you care about. But when thinking kind of strategically from an advocacy perspective or a lobbying perspective, we're building relationships with not just the people who represent our districts, but committee chairs, floor leaders, caucus leadership. They often have more influence over whether a bill moves at all. So, when we are going to gather for different lobby days and things like that, sometimes we'll send people to offices or places that aren't their own district because those are the decision makers, right? So there's kind of a network of people you have to influence, not just your own rep, even though that's usually where we go first as a constituent. Well, thanks for that. I think that was a great summary of leadership. This slide is a beautiful roadmap of the legislative process and really kind of walks y'all through the life of a bill in Michigan. And it is important to remember before I even get into it that most bills do not make it all the way through this process. A lot of bills are just ideas that don't actually get anywhere, and many bills don't pass. I would say very confidently that majority of bills do not get passed. So that's something to know. And it starts with idea and drafting. And ideas can come from anyone, including constituents, organizations, advocacy groups like us. And then this idea is formulated into a drafting request by a legislative office and submitted to something called LSB, which is the Legislative Service Bureau. And this also sometimes includes an entire cycle of feedback and edits, which we are actually in the middle of right now for some of our bill ideas and things that we're prioritizing. So after things get drafted and LSB, sends it back and it gets to the point where we're confident in the bill language, you have introduction. And so the bill is introduced in either the House or the Senate and assigned a bill number and then sent to a committee. Now, committee review is often the most critical stage. So committees hold hearings, they take public testimony, and may even amend the bill in committee as well. And this is where advocacy, including testimony from social workers and you all, can be especially influential. This is a lot of the times where we're saying, call to action. If you could be in person in Lansing, we need you there. Our bill's being heard in committee. And it's can be very difficult sometimes to even get it a hearing. So once we get that hearing, that's our time to shine in a lot of ways. If the bill advances through committee, it then goes to a chamber vote. And if it passes, the process has to completely repeat itself for a committee process in the other chamber. So committee review, debate, and then another chamber vote. And then finally, if both chambers agree on the final language with any amendments that we've come up with in the process, the bill then goes to the governor's desk. And the governor can sign it, veto it, or I'm pretty sure also, is that correct? Can it be allowed to become a law without a signature, Chandra? Is that one of the processes? Yeah. So there's also a process where without signature can also be inducted into law. And I just want to have kind of one more key advocacy reminder. I have some of these notes on here just because I think it's important to kind of break it down. But most bills stall in committee. I think I mentioned that. So most either don't get passed out of committee after a hearing or they never even get scheduled for a hearing. And so that's why relationship building and early engagement often matter more than that last minute outreach. Working hard to ensure that it does reach that committee process. And I also want to just quickly housekeep. If anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We can ask questions at the end, or we can have people come off mute at the end to ask questions. So just make a note of it or drop it in the chat, and we can make sure to follow up. I know we're loading a lot of information in today. Okay, so just as an update for folks about the things we're working on. Oh, Chandra, go ahead.
Sorry. Uh, Jess, can we go back to the last slide for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
kind of want to give like a big picture of like Michigan. So
yeah,
Michigan is
please.
a full-time legislature. We are not a part-time legislature. So we have lots of bills being introduced, thousands. This session has been a little bit different because of split government, I will say. It's a little slower to get bill introductions just because there's some hesitancy, you know, uh, with lawmakers to want to introduce a lot of pieces of legislation right now. And like I said, leadership also plays a part of committee hearings and whether you get a hearing, but they also play a part in whether, their Republican or Democratic members will sponsor a bill. Because that is a thing as well of, the Republican or Democratic caucus doesn't believe in this effort. They don't feel like it aligns with their values or their views. So that plays a part in how bill introductions happen as well. And I will say, as far as like the stakeholder process for engaging lawmakers to get a bill introduced, essentially means, meeting with them, familiarizing the idea with them. And also because we have term limits in Michigan, we have a lot of newer folks who are new to legislature, new to policy themselves. So it's a lot of education that stakeholders have to do, specifically like NASW. We meet with a lot of lawmakers to try to, convince them to basically work on our licensure issues, work on other things that we're focused on as well. Um, so that kind of happens. And after you get a sponsor or multiple bill sponsors to, introduce your bill, it goes to the Legislative Service Bureau process. So that's the drafting process. So that's a nonpartisan arm that basically they're all legalese lawyers and they actually put the pen to paper. And then
Mhm.
from there, you do some stakeholder engagement with other folks to make sure there's no, nothing that you're missing in feedback. This is the time the stakeholder engagement piece is really important before you introduce a bill, mainly because, once that bill's introduced, you have to go through a lot of technical amendments and changes to get changes to the bill.
Mhm.
And I'll say, as far as introductions go, so I know we talked a little bit about Michigan has a 2-year session. So bills are still technically alive and well within the 2 years. So in the Senate bills always start with number one. The first bill that's introduced is always Senate Bill number one. And then the House, it always starts with 4001. So um, in the 2-year session, the numbers don't change. So, for example, a House Bill 4280 that was introduced last year, but the bill number is still 4280 this year. So, it's keeping it consistent. So, bill numbers don't change within the 2-year session. They only change. So, say 2027, we'll have fresh bill numbers, but right now they're staying the same. And Jess was right that, a lot of bills they they essentially get a committee assignment and they die.
Mhm.
And there's for a lot of reasons. It's for maybe the chair of the committee just doesn't want to take it up. Maybe there's not a lot of capacity or time for that effort. And also who you choose as a bill sponsor can play into whether you get a committee hearing or not, because that's the name of the game in politics. Um, And then usually if you are successful, and there's a lot of some of the committees that NASW engages with the most is health policy. They have insurance committee. Um, we also watch a little bit of the DHHS committees for other efforts as well. And there are budget committees, specifically if we talk appropriations, we're talking about budget, we're talking about money. It's not really policy, but we do, monitor those as well. And then if you are very lucky and successful to get your bill out of committee, that's a great first step because most
Hmm.
bills in Michigan don't make it out of committee. And then they go to the floor for a floor vote in the first chamber. And then as just said, you advance to the second chamber. And if this is always the tricky part of when you get your bill out of the first chamber, say the House, they loved your bill, it's wonderful. And then the Senate says, oh, well, we need to make some changes.
Hmm.
And so you go through the committee process, and the Senate wants to make changes. If the Senate makes changes to your bill, you have to send it back to the House, and the House has to concur and vote on it again. And
Hmm.
this can slow down the process significantly. And if you are on a very tight timeline, like we're almost, midway through this 2026 session year. So that's really important to try to get your bill as far as long as quickly as possible. And then if your bill is so great that it makes it to the governor's desk and she signs it, it's wonderful. She does have a 14-day window to sign it.
Hmm.
Or of course she has the option to, just leave it alone and it'll automatically become law. In order to override a veto, which has rarely happened, I think in my time under the, Whitmer administration, I think that's only attempted to happen at least twice. And it didn't go through because you need 2/3 vote in both chambers. And that's really hard to get to override a veto of the governor.
Hmm.
And there's a couple questions in here. Jess, I'm fine if you want to answer them, but I'm fine to answer them as well.
Yeah, I'll read them out loud just for the recording. Let's see. So, if a bill is introduced, does it always go through committee review, or is this ever bypassed? Yeah, it has to go through committee. From my understanding, that's yeah a big part of the process. I would say a main portion of the process, unless there's an exception that I don't know about, Chandria. But from my understanding, it's got to go
Yeah.
through committee.
So every bill gets assigned to committee,
Yes.
but you can get a bill discharged to the floor. That's
Okay.
one of the special things that happens mostly in lame duck, where, the committee chair and leadership is like, no, this bill is whether too important or too timely, we need to discharge it and we need a floor vote. So that is an option that leadership can do. And mostly it's done in lame duck.
Yeah, you're right. I wasn't really around for lame duck session. I forgot that's definitely more of a dynamic that happens during that time. Can you actually clarify for the group what a lame duck session is, just so folks have an understanding?
Yeah, so after the election, the general election, it is the time basically the legislature has the short window. So usually after the November election until the sine die, December 31st, before a new session, a new year starts, that is lame duck. And it's essentially the time frame that if you have a bill out there introduced, or honestly, I think a lot of bills are introduced in lame duck because you're trying to get your bill passed. It is that time to basically before a new session and sometimes also before a new administration changes over, to basically it's the most I say policy wise, the most intense and chaotic time because there's so many competing priorities.
Hmm.
And it's a time to also be great advocates because there's so much moving that you're trying to get your issue to the top, amongst thousands of other policy bills that are moving. So it's a great time for advocacy.
Hmm. Absolutely. I'm also going to let you take this question as well. I know we're in budget season, so it's a good question. When is a good time to approach local legislators about requesting an appropriation?
I will say, now is a good time. We are in
Yeah.
budget season. If you do have an appropriations request, so end of last year, maybe around November, December, the state departments would put in together their budgets of what they would like to see in the governor's executive recommendation. So each department has their own budget priorities, policy priorities, and they give those to the executive, to the governor. The governor plans to do her present her exec rec speech, presentation tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So now is a great time to talk to your local lawmakers about our appropriation. And budget season will hopefully only go to June 30 this year because it's election season, but it might go longer like last year. So feel free to reach out.
And that's going to be really interesting. So I hope folks are able to tune in if you're interested in hearing some of those executive recommendations. And then final question, which is still relevant to this. If a citizen wants to suggest a bill, the first step would be to try to get your senator or rep on board. Is that right? Yeah, that's a great place to start. Talk to your folks about your bill idea. And I want to emphasize as well, and we'll talk about kind of advocacy tips later on, but you know, you are the social worker. You are the subject matter expert. And so coming to that meeting and explaining what the issue is from a informed, experienced perspective can be really powerful. And oftentimes, if I'm kind of going in on my own, I will ask just honestly, politically, does it make sense for your office to file this bill? Or would you recommend another office that I could partner with? Or maybe you could co-author it or whatever it is. Just kind of open the dialogue about political strategy with the office if they seem supportive. Because sometimes they got their plate full, but they know, someone else who could definitely be a champion, or they could say, well, I'm a Dem and this really should have a Republican sponsor on it. Here are some offices you could talk to. But I always start with my office. I always start with my office and say, I'm your constituent. I care about this. This is what I know from the on the ground experience, and then just get their advice on kind of where to proceed from there. And sometimes they'll love it and have space for it, and it'll make sense politically for them to take it up. And so, you could have that bill filed by your own rep, which is great. So I just say open the dialogue once you get there. Because sometimes, just because they don't introduce the bill doesn't mean they don't care about it, right? There's some other political dynamics to think about whenever you're drafting. As Chandra pointed out, I'm so glad you mentioned that choosing a sponsor is everything in that early stage. And there's a lot of work that goes into the political strategy around that. But yes, talk to your reps. Anything else on this slide, Chandra? I really appreciate everything you added, just the political dynamics, some of the technical issues that go around this. So thanks for jumping in. Now let's talk about some social work bills. So, we've been going through this whole process and we're still in that kind of early stage of things. We have a couple bill numbers here, a couple of them don't have bill numbers. But I want to talk about it. So right now we are working on several bills and draft proposals to support social workers and build the social work workforce. I'm just going to summarize these a little bit for y'all so you know what they're about, so they're on your radar. So first, insurance clawbacks or chargebacks. House Bill 5478 addresses the practice of insurers attempting to take back or demanding payments months or even years after the services are provided or rendered. And this bill tightens the timeline, limits retroactive recoupments to a reasonable 90-day period, and adds transparency requirements so providers know why money is being taken back. And right now, Michigan is one of only 10 states that have no limit on the amount of time that insurance companies can demand recoupment. So, literally any time in the future, they can demand or request any amount of money for, whatever reason they have. And it is primarily hurting our private practice, our small providers, those folks who don't have deep pockets to just pay out, hundreds or thousands of dollars for whatever reason they're requesting it for. And so we think 90 days is reasonable. Like I said, we're only one of 10 states. So, 40 states have some sort of limit. And this is actually, I think I'm optimistic about that with this one because we do have a Republican author for this bill. And it is seeming, from my perspective, to have bipartisan support. So I'm hopeful that this will progress fairly easy through the legislature. As we said, there's a lot of barriers to getting things heard, even if there's support for it. But it's looking really good. So I'm very, very excited about this insurance clawback legislation. And I really hope that we can get it implemented. This is also something that doesn't just impact social workers, right? It impacts tons of other providers, whether behavioral health or not. this is something that's impacting a lot of folks. And so, because of that, I think we have a lot of different types of voices from a lot of different types of professions. This is something that we have been working on for a while, but we're seeing folks like the Chiropractors Association getting involved in this, so things like that. So just to kind of, it's helpful because it has a broad impact. And second, we're looking at our limited license renewal extension. So House Bill 4280 extends the maximum renewal period for limited licenses, and the bill language currently has 6 years to being changed to 10 years. So that's 9 renewals total. So you get your initial one, and then you have 10 years, which is 9 renewals. And I think this is important, obviously, because many social workers leave the field because of rigid timelines that collide with real life. You have, the exam availability issues, work demands, and extending that renewal period helps retain those trained professionals who are already serving their communities with a limited license. So extending it really just supports social workers in the field already. And then third, we have a scholarship program for repeat test takers. So we're working on some policy concepts, including the scholarship support for social workers who have taken but not yet passed that licensure exam. And this program, in its idea, would award up to $1,000 for exam fees. And we're also hoping to add in some other provisions that the funds could be used for, including the costs for licensure exam prep courses. So I'm very passionate about that because I think if you didn't get it the first time and you're getting some money from the state to pay for it the second time, I think that prep course in the middle between those two is really, really helpful. The goal here is simple, reduce financial barriers to social work licensure. We want folks to get licensed, and if we can give a scholarship to make that happen, then we should. And finally, we are trying to establish that alternative pathway to licensure exams. So the concept here is to allow the exam requirement to be waived for certain applicants who meet certain criteria, including completing an additional 2,000 hours of supervised hours beyond what's currently required. And I want to be clear too, just for framing, for whenever, if y'all do engage in legislative advocacy around this is not eliminating standards. It is recognizing that experience, competence, and practice are valid measures of readiness. And I think that additional 2,000 hours is substantial enough, to be able to waive the exam. So, as we know, there are issues with the exam and people being filtered out or blocked from the profession because of issues with the exam. And this is going to be, I think, very influential in helping get more social workers who are qualified. And then just as an important takeaway for all of these bills, none of these are happening in isolation. And where we're at with each of them, seeing movement, that reflects sustained advocacy, feedback from social workers across the state, and an understanding of how to move policy in the divided legislature. So again, tons of strategy, tons of collaboration. And this is what progress often looks like in Lansing. It's incremental and technical and very much shaped by timing, committees, and coalition work. So a lot of these things are backed by our coalitions and advocacy partners that have been fighting for similar things, or at least supporting the social work specific ones. And so we're on advocacy calls, we're on coalition calls and meetings, we're emailing with other organizations, trying to strategize and align messaging, and working with those lawmakers to then ask what they need from an advocacy point of view. So lots of communication, lots of relationship building. Years have been put into some of these things. And so it is a great feeling to see them being potentially prioritized this year. Anything you want to add about these bills or any part of the process, Chandra?
Yeah, I'll answer the question
Oh,
where the
thanks.
bills at right now on the flow chart. So the insurance clawback legislation was just introduced last month, so it's been assigned to the Health Policy Committee, and the sponsor of this bill is Representative Vanderwall, and he's also the House Health Policy Chair. So really good chances of getting movement. It does have bipartisan support from a lot of Democrats who have been in the insurance industry previously before. So I really feel like it's really good chances of getting movement, especially in the House on that bill. Um, the second priority, House Bill 4280, that's been introduced since last year by Representative Kim Edwards, and she is a social worker. And this is more of a Democratic-led bill. She's a Democrat, but she does have bipartisan support also. She has a co-sponsor, Republican co-sponsor on it. Um, Due to the political dynamics, to be honest, right now, the House Republicans are not taking up a lot of Democratic-led bills. So that was one of the reasons why 4280 has been installed, just because of the political polarizing nature right now. Um, so that's kind of where the efforts are. And I'll say 3 and 4 are in the LSB drafting phase. We have seen multiple drafts, so we're trying to get it as fine-tuned as possible. So we do have actual physical drafts. They're just not introduced yet.
Hmm. And I mean, they look good. I think our feedback was thorough. Like Sandra said, it's all fine tuning and making sure it's, perfect before we get there because it is a whole process to amend it once it gets to committee. So, but we've wrapped up our comments on that. So I hope that we can get those introduced soon. Um, and I just want to touch on something said in the chat without really kind of asking the question, but I do know that there are different opinions about the licensure exam waiver, and I encourage you to, talk to folks about it and engage in conversation around it. We have I mentioned some of the issues we've seen with the exam. There was some data that came out a couple of years ago about some biases within the exam that actually prevent people of color from entering the field, and the pass rates for Black social workers are very drastically different than what for white social workers, and a lot of it is because of question biases within the exam. And so even though licensure exams are important for ensuring competence in the social work field, I do want to emphasize that it's not perfect, and that oftentimes that lived practice experience, that lived supervised experience, is very important for shaping readiness to serve in a social work role. And so I recognize that there are differing opinions on this, but this is something that we're advocating for to ensure that qualified social workers who may be impacted by some of those exam biases or for other reasons couldn't pass the exam are supported into the social profession. And we have a huge deficit of social workers and behavioral mental health providers in the state of Michigan. I think like 70% of the state is a mental health shortage area. So we really need to be creating pathways to licensure and not roadblocks. So anything we can do to support social workers who are already practicing, get to that point of licensure, we want to be supportive of. So thank you for the question and for bringing up the fact that there are other sides to this debate, as we are aware. And Chandra, I'll pass it to you. What should we expect in 2026?
All right, so we are in the second year of a 2-year legislative session. So right now we are in budget season. Like I said earlier, the governor is going to give her exec reg budget presentation to tell her budget priorities and what she would like funded, essentially. And also it's campaign season as well. So the House and the Senate are up for re-election. So the Senate, I think all but 2 senators are term limited because we do have term limits in Michigan. So any lawmaker, whether representative or senator, they have 12 years total to serve in the Michigan legislature. And so you will see a totally, completely new Senate next year. And in the House, you will see a lot of incumbents come back and you'll see some new faces as well. So what that does as far as, the policy and the, kind of the timeline on things of there's so many distractions right now in the legislature because budget season usually takes up the first half of the year. We usually go until June 30, because that's usually when, in normal times, the budget will be passed. But last year, I think a lot of we went until, the October 1 and had a little mini state shutdown. And that could happen again this year. I don't necessarily foresee that because folks want to get out there and campaign, especially this election in Michigan is so detrimental to, the makeup of what will happen in 2027. Will there be, another Dem trifecta? Will it be split government again? Also, we also have the executive also up for reelection as well. We'll have someone, new in the gubernatorial office. So if you are hearing a lot about budget advocacy in this first half of the year, that's perfectly normal. There will still be some policy committees who meet. So me and the NASW team, we will still be pushing policy. It's just hard to do both in tandem from a legislative perspective sometimes because when you're so focused on budget, it's hard to get people focused on anything but in regard to policy. And also, there will be a time where leadership says, okay, we're not doing any more policy committees. We're strictly just focused on appropriations and budget. So expect that kind of in the beginning of the year, but please still stay engaged through action alerts and anything that will help us because we still are going to be pushing for all of the efforts that we just mentioned. And also, this is where having two chambers helps because, maybe the House is all solely focused on budget, but the Senate is still doing policy committees. And we can have a few, Senate committees, over in the second chamber. So, that will likely happen because they operate totally differently because they are led by two different leaders, obviously. Um, and I will say, it's heavy campaign mode. So there are a lot of social workers who are announcing. And I will say, just as far as the Senate goes, um, since they have one vacancy, the Kristen McDonald Rivas seat, that is very, and there will be a May special election. That will be very important to see what will happen and, whether, voting, polling, what's the temperament out there looking like as far as like Democrat, Republican, or independents. Um, I think that special election will tell us a lot about the upcoming general election for sure. So that's kind of what to expect. But like I said, please continue to stay engaged as far as, action alerts and just staying engaged with all of our efforts because we're going to continue them. Even though this year will be, you kind of have to get through all of the other things that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that kind of heads up on what we're going to expect. And if anyone has specific questions about you know policies that may or may not be prioritized, I think even just tuning into the exec recommendations tomorrow, that'll be a really good temperature check on what at least the executive branch is going to be prioritizing, which is a good roadmap for folks. I think there's a couple questions in the chat. Do you mind taking those, Andrea?
Yeah, the term limit
You just answer
question, you have
that.
12 years total, collectively, in that, like, period in Michigan. So you can only serve 12 years total. It used to be different, but now it's 12 years total, which is
Mhm.
why most of the senators, they were like House reps and then they moved to the Senate. And so now they're termed. So they've been around
Mhm.
for a while.
Great. And then do you have any insight on why there hasn't been a special election for that empty seat?
One thing about special elections, they cost the local voters money.
Mm,
And so in Michigan, we don't like to do a lot of special elections.
I missed
So
that.
um, they had their pre-primary 2 weeks ago. So it's a Democrat running and then a Republican that's running. The Democrat ended up getting about 26,000 votes. And the Republican got about 19. So they will face off in the May special. And people are really taking like the polling from that to show that there is, a shift happening, especially in that seat, like the Saginaw Bay area.
Mhm.
And will it be kind of following the national trends and, the general election?
Mhm. Yeah, I have noticed that's not really a tool in the tool belt that Michigan uses very often. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Okay, let's wrap up and then maybe we can have time for any more questions. But I do like that we've been answering them throughout. I think that's worked well. Deshandra, do you want to talk about some advocacy tips? I know you've been doing this for a while, so I think it's helpful to kind of prep people for any meetings they may want to set up.
Yeah, for any also like meetings that you'd like to do, whether in Lansing or in person, I always encourage folks to go to their in-district office hours with their state rep or state senator, mainly because you're not on a 30-minute time frame like you are in Lansing. Um, So I will say, and also please use your expertise as social workers. Please use stories from your professional experience, personal experience, um, because, and also going back to term limits, a lot of these folks are newer to policy. They're newer to these dynamics. Um, so I will say always use your own stories. And then even if you think that your lawmaker, or a committee member, whoever you're meeting with, will not like vote the way, you want them to vote, or they may not see like your perspective, always still try to influence them because I always say, like I used to tell my school board members, there's always someone on the opposite side telling them something else. So, and you don't want to give, lawmakers, the excuse of saying, well, I never heard from my social work community. They're fine with this bill, but they don't really care. So you don't want that to happen. So I will always say, please reach out. And also, building a two-way relationship where you and your lawmaker, they know you by name and face. And also, I always encourage like reach out if you want to even invite them to a social work event as
Mhm.
well. You don't always necessarily have to reach out when you necessarily want or need assistance with legislation or policy. You can reach out in a casual nature and say, "Hey, we wanted to invite you to this event. I think it'd be good if showed up." Um, so I would say those are my advocacy tips, and also I would say like be confident because they are looking for feedback and on the ground stories because they may not know everything about social work like you all do, but giving them a social work perspective and another lens is always so helpful.
Mhm.
And I will say whether you go into a coffee hour or 30-minute Lansing meeting, if you don't have an answer to something, it is totally okay. Just say, I don't have that information right now, and I'll get back to you.
Mhm. And
And I'll plug staff for a second. Sorry, Jess. If you meet with legislative staff, please don't feel as if you're getting punted or if, they are not very well seasoned, folks. Those staffers most likely know as much or more information about a policy, a bill, or things that are happening in district more so than the lawmaker themselves, because they are the staff that prep the lawmakers before we go into their offices, 10 minutes before they're prepping them right before. So
Mhm.
please, if you get and I would ask for staff contact info as well because they're, easy to get a hold of, whether via phone or email. So please always interact with staff when you have the opportunity. Okay, that's my spiel, Jess.
Yeah. No, that's good. I was just going to echo, like, I was just going to kind of add on to some things you were saying. Yeah, definitely. I was just to echo the last thing you said. Staff are like the lifeblood of those offices, and oftentimes they will have specific policy areas that they specialize in. So if you're bringing something up and you kind of can ahead of time let them know maybe what you're planning on talking about, that can help them assign the proper staff member to your visit. And those recommendations from staff are have a lot of weight. So it's yeah, it's fun and it's cool to meet with the actual lawmaker, but a lot of the times it's staff, and I have gotten a lot done working with staff and building relationships with those staff members, and so I think that's great. And I just wanted to emphasize, some of the things on this advocacy tips sheet on the PowerPoint. A lot of this is social work skills, y'all. And I am such a fan of integrated practice. Like, use those interpersonal skills in these settings. Like, I think it's so important to be an active listener, but also a good like summarizer, but also being, reading body language, like building rapport, building relationships, follow-ups, and like even when you think about like, ethical termination, with a client, thinking about like how do I leave this person with next steps, right? I always am doing that. I'm like, what is my plan to follow up with you? What are some next steps I can expect from you? And just really kind of always thinking about it as I'm using my interpersonal social work skills in a policy setting, and that's integrated practice, that's macro. So I really just, y'all can all do this. You're actually very uniquely positioned to be really effective advocates. So just believe in yourself, be confident and what you know and what you've experienced. And I think we had a couple questions before we get into other events happening and things to get involved in. Dwayne asked a question about the most recent update on the bills from lame duck last year that were being held from the governor for signing.
Um, So essentially, what the courts decided on the nine bills that Speaker Hall decided not to turn over to the governor from last session, they are still being held by the House Republicans. So the court stepped in essentially when the Senate Democrats filed a lawsuit and said that, yes, it is unconstitutional to hold the nine bills, but essentially, we cannot force Speaker Hall to turn them over. There is no timeline in our Constitution, unfortunately, that says when he has to turn them over.
Mhm.
So it, and a lot of the stakeholders are still holding out hope, hopefully, that he will turn them over. But essentially, there's nothing so far that has forced him to have to. And a lot of former speakers have weighed in saying that, and this has only happened once in Michigan, I believe, like in the 40s. So a lot of former speakers weighed in and said there was never a timeline given to me of when I had to turn the bills over to the administration. I mean, I just did in good faith effort, but so far, the courts made their decision of he has to, but they didn't say when,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that, for sure. I know it got answered in the chat, but someone was asking, about other bills that we're supporting, and it made me think about this. I went over those four bills that we are specifically working on. I want to make it very clear, those are bills that are like we have been trying to get done personally, but there's tons of legislation that we are supporting all the time. And there are things that other groups, advocacy groups, are working on that might be their main issue area. So the question was, about, protection against ICE and immigration. There are people who their entire organizations, their entire advocacy profile is about immigration. And how we work in those spaces is we want to amplify and support the work that the leaders of those spaces are doing already, not duplicate. And so even though those kinds of that bill, our package, our 508 through 510 wasn't listed on the slide, we're still supporting it. We're still up there. We're still engaging in it. We're still supporting it very, very clearly. They just want our original ideas, right? And so I talked about coalition work. Everything's coalition work. So, whether it's anything related to community well-being, we're involved in, whether it's LGBTQ rights or, protections for immigrants, anything like that. If it aligns with our code of ethics, we are dropping a card. We may even give testimony. It just depends on the situation. But I just wanted to clarify that too, just so y'all understand the dynamic. Everything is social work. It's kind of wild. Like I can't think of a single policy that isn't somehow like connected to social work or social work values or social work ethics or have, challenging those things. So, we have a pretty, broad advocacy profile and typically will engage in a lot of things starting from, I think, our previous policy director at National said it, from infancy to death, the entire lifespan and every system that people interact with. There's a lot that we have to think about. So, we really rely on our people and other specific advocacy spaces to lead that work, and we do our best to support everything we can. Just to wrap up, I know we have like 5 minutes left, but I just want to let y'all know how else to get involved. Vote in every election. Join an NASW state or national committee or work group. We have LSP, which is our Legislative Social Policy Committee, and also MPACE, which is our Political Action Committee. There is information about both of those on our website, and that's a great space to get involved. If you loved this conversation, if you're fired up about advocacy, sign up for LSP. That's a really easy way to get involved. We accept everyone who wants to sign up, and so that'll be great. And I'll make sure to send in the follow-up some information about joining those. I don't have the specific links on me right now, but there are Google Forms that you can fill out. Testify. So like we said, once it gets to committee, that testimony is really going to need to happen. And then, if you're a writer, write an op-ed in your local paper. That's kind of an area that we don't really have much staff support for. So it really helps when people engage in it. Organize a rally or protest. if you're in that space, if that's your way to engage. And then attend more events. So Capital Action Day is coming up on March 17th. I know it's been historically, a major student attended event, but I love, love, love to see professionals at that because y'all have practice experience and a lot of students do too, but y'all are in it at the current moment, which can be so powerful, especially for things like clawbacks where it's impacting practicing social workers. So just keep that in mind. Come to Capital Action Day, register for that. We'll have a couple of prep events. I think I have a slide on it. Yeah. March 17th, we'll have a couple of webinar events beforehand, I think on the 5th and the 14th, that you can come to, and we'll get even more in depth on how you can advocate for those and give you one pagers and all that. Yeah, all our events can be found at nasbmichigan.org/events. If you're a student, we have our National Student Series, which is great. So feel free to check that out as well. If you're not following us on social media, a lot of our policy engagement stuff happens there, in addition to our member emails. So be a member, follow us on social media, and you should be informed on what's going on politically with us. And then I did put Deshandra and I's email on here in case y'all have any questions. I know folks had some thoughts about some of the things that we're working on. I'm happy to talk about it at any time. So, we can set up a 30-minute video chat, whatever you want to do, phone call, and we can talk through it. But so thank you all so much. And hope to see you at Capital Action Day or any of our other events coming up. Feel free to check it out.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all.